Every road in Europe leads to Rome, not figuratively, literally. In 2019, a team of data scientists mapped every road on the continent and traced them backward. The result was a web of lines, thousands upon thousands of them, all converging on a single point in central Italy. 1,400 years after the empire collapsed, the roads still point home. The legal system you live under descends from Roman law. The language you are hearing right now carries Latin roots in nearly 60% of its vocabulary. The concrete in your apartment building uses a formula the Romans perfected. The calendar on your wall bears the name of a Roman dictator in July and a Roman emperor in August. The very idea that a government should have a senate, separation of powers, checks and balances, all of it traces back to the banks of the Tiber. And yet, Rome fell, the most successful civilization in human history, a state that endured for over 1,000 years and governed 70 million people across 3 continents, collapsed into ruin. Europe plunged into a period so bleak that we simply call it the Dark Ages. 1,000 years of technological regression. 1,000 years of lost knowledge. 1,000 years during which the population of the city of Rome shrank from over 1 million to roughly 30,000. A farming village huddled among ruins it could no longer understand. There is one decision that may have started all of it. One moment, on a summer day in 376 AD, when a single emperor said yes instead of no. We will come back to that decision. I have spent a long time with this particular story, longer than most. And what I keep coming back to is not the scale of what was lost, it is how close it all came to never happening at all. But first, consider what was lost. The Romans had indoor plumbing, hot and cold running water delivered through lead pipes to private homes. After the fall, Europeans would not have indoor plumbing again for over 1,000 years. The Romans built a concrete dome, the Pantheon, that remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome on Earth. We have not surpassed it. Think about that. 2,000 years of engineering progress, and the Pantheon still holds the record. The Romans performed cataract surgery. They had apartment buildings 9 stories tall. They manufactured glass windows. They had a postal service that could deliver a letter from Britain to Egypt in a matter of weeks. All of this vanished. Not slowly, not gracefully. It fell apart within a few generations, and the people living in the aftermath spent centuries forgetting that any of it had ever existed. And there is a specific reason it happened. Not a vague decline, not a slow fade. There is a name, a date, and a river. We will come back to that too. To understand what went wrong, you need to understand the Danube. The Danube River stretches 1,770 miles from the Black Forest in Germany to the Black Sea. For the Roman Empire, it was not a river. It was a wall, the northern border of civilization in the Roman mind, and they fortified it accordingly. Along its length, the Romans built a chain of forts, watchtowers, and garrison towns spaced roughly every 15 miles. At peak strength, nearly a third of the entire Roman army, around 150,000 soldiers, stood guard along the Danube frontier. The soldiers who patrolled that frontier lived entire careers without seeing the interior of the empire they defended. They were born in the garrison towns, married local women, raised children who would take their place on the wall. Generation after generation, watching the far bank. In winter, when the river froze, the sentries doubled. They knew that a frozen Danube was an open door. They lit signal fires that could relay a warning from the Black Sea to the Alps in a matter of hours, a chain of flames stretching across 1,000 miles of frontier. The system worked. It was not glamorous, and the historians in Rome rarely wrote about it, but it worked. Across that river lived the barbarian world. Germanic tribes, Sarmatian horsemen, and Gothic kingdoms spread across the forests and plains of what is now Hungary, Romania, and Ukraine. The Romans traded with them, fought them, sometimes hired them. But the river held. For 4 centuries, the Danube was the line, and the line did not break. Then, in 375 AD, something changed. Far to the east, on the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea, a people called the Huns came riding out of Central Asia. We do not know exactly why they moved west. I almost left this part out. The sources are so thin that it feels dishonest to speculate. But the silence itself tells us something. We do not know the face of the chieftain who first pointed his horse toward Europe, or what he said to the riders behind him. But the Gothic historian Jordanes, writing a century and a half later, recorded the terror. He said the Huns seemed less like men and more like a natural disaster, something elemental, like a fire sweeping across dry grass. The Huns fought from horseback with composite bows that could punch through armor at 100 yards. They did not siege cities or hold territory in the traditional sense. They swept through, took what they wanted, and moved on. The Gothic kingdoms, which had held their own against Rome for generations, had no answer for this kind of warfare. Their heavy infantry formations, built to hold shield walls against Roman legions, were useless against riders who never stood still long enough to be hit. The Huns hit the Gothic kingdoms first. The Greuthungi, an Eastern Gothic people who had built a stable kingdom north of the Black Sea, were shattered in a matter of months. Their king, Ermanaric, took his own life rather than face capture. The Tervingi, a Western Gothic people living closer to the Danube, fared only slightly better. Their leader, a man named Athanaric, tried to fight. He dug defensive lines along the Dniester River, sent out scouts, prepared ambushes in the forest. The Huns rode around every one of them. They crossed the Dniester at night, upstream, and attacked from a direction Athanaric had not thought to guard. By the spring of 376, roughly 200,000 Goths, men, women, children, the elderly, the sick stood on the northern bank of the Danube River. Behind them, the Huns. Ahead of them, the Roman Empire. They had nowhere else to go. Their leaders, Fritigern and Alavivus, sent messengers across the river to the Emperor Valens, who was in Antioch at the time, 1,000 miles to the southeast, preparing for a war against Persia. The message was simple: let us cross. We will serve in your armies. We will farm your empty lands. We will be your loyal subjects. Just let us cross. Valens said yes. This is the decision. This is the hinge. And you need to understand why it seemed reasonable at the time, because it did. Valens was not a fool. The Roman Empire had been absorbing barbarian groups for centuries. Settled barbarians paid taxes and provided soldiers. The empire had vast stretches of depopulated land in the Balkans, land ravaged by plague and war, land that needed farmers. And 200,000 new subjects, including tens of thousands of fighting men, would be a powerful asset in the coming war with Persia. On paper, it made perfect sense. The problem was the execution. The Roman officials responsible for settling the Goths were corrupt. Staggeringly, catastrophically corrupt. The commander Lupicinus and his colleague Maximus saw 200,000 desperate refugees and saw a business opportunity. They controlled the food supply. They charged extortionate prices. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, a former soldier who had no patience for corruption, recorded what happened next with barely contained fury. He tells us that starving Gothic families traded their children into slavery for dog meat. One child for one dog. Think about that exchange for a moment. A parent handing over a son or daughter for a dead animal because the alternative was watching that child starve. Lupicinus even invited the Gothic leaders to a banquet while their people starved outside the walls. It was meant as a show of Roman superiority. What it actually showed was Roman contempt. And contempt, when directed at armed and desperate men, has consequences. Within 2 years, the Goths revolted. On August 9, 378 AD, Emperor Valens marched the Roman field army out to crush the rebellion at Adrianople, in what is now northwestern Turkey. He did not wait for reinforcements from the Western Emperor Gratian, who was days away with a second army. Valens wanted the glory for himself. He had spent his reign in the shadow of his more capable brother, Valentinian, and now Valentinian was dead. This would be his victory. His alone. It was the worst military decision in Roman history. The Gothic cavalry, which Roman scouts had failed to locate, broke the Roman left flank in a thundering charge, then swept behind the infantry and pinned them against their own shields. The Roman soldiers could not raise their arms to swing their swords. They were crushed together so tightly that the dead remained standing, held upright by the press of bodies around them. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army died on that field. Somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 soldiers. Valens himself was killed, his body never recovered. Some accounts say he burned alive in a farmhouse where he had taken shelter, wounded and abandoned by his guards. Adrianople did not destroy the Roman Empire, not immediately, but it did something worse. It proved the empire could not protect its own borders. It planted a Gothic nation permanently inside Roman territory that Rome could never fully absorb or expel. 32 years later, in 410 AD, those same Visigoths under their king Alaric sacked the city of Rome itself, the first time a foreign army had entered the city in 800 years. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem when he heard the news, wept. The city which had taken the whole world, he wrote, was itself taken. 66 years after that, in 476, the last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, whose very name was a diminutive, a small echo of the founder, was deposed by a barbarian general, and the Western Roman Empire simply ceased to exist. One decision, one river crossing, a cascade that took a century to play out, but that began on a single summer day when an emperor, distracted by a Persian war and tempted by the promise of cheap soldiers, said yes instead of no. I am genuinely curious what you think about this. Was Valens foolish? Or was he making the only rational choice with the information he had? Tell me in the comments. But what if he had said no? What if Valens had looked at those 200,000 Goths on the far bank and made a different calculation? What if he had reinforced the Danube garrisons, turned the refugees away, and let the Huns and the Goths sort out their own wars on the far side of the river? The Goths would have suffered terribly. We should not pretend otherwise. Thousands would have died in the chaos of the Hun invasions, scattered across the plains of Eastern Europe without shelter or protection. It would have been a humanitarian catastrophe by any measure. But the Danube would have held. And if the Danube held in 376, then there is no Battle of Adrianople, no Gothic nation planted permanently inside Roman territory, no sack of Rome in 410, no Vandals, no Visigoths, no Ostrogoths carving the western provinces into barbarian kingdoms. The cascade never starts. Think about that. An empire that governed the known world for 1,000 years, brought low not by a great enemy or an internal revolution, but by a bureaucratic decision about immigration policy on a summer afternoon. In our timeline, Europe descended into fragmentation. Libraries burned, aqueducts crumbled. The recipe for concrete was forgotten. Cities emptied. The vast network of Roman roads, those same roads that still converge on a single point in central Italy, fell into disrepair and were slowly swallowed by forest and field. In the timeline we are about to explore, none of that happens. The river holds, the empire endures, and the world that emerges on the other side is almost unrecognizable. This is the story of what might have been. Not a fantasy, but a disciplined thought experiment built on what we know about Roman engineering, Roman governance, Roman ambition, and the forces that shaped the ancient world. We will follow the empire forward, decade by decade, as it faces the challenges that our Rome could not survive, and we will ask at every turn, what changes? What stays the same? And what does a world look like where the Dark Ages never came? Some of you are drifting off by now. Good. That is exactly what this is for. The story will be here when you come back. For the next entry in the archive, I have been exploring something very different. A city that was buried alive, frozen in a single afternoon, and everything we have found inside it since. But that is for another night. The answer begins at the river, and the river holds. Chapter 2, The Danube Holds. The messenger reached Valens on a Tuesday. We know this because Ammianus Marcellinus recorded the date, and because the Roman bureaucracy, whatever its flaws, kept meticulous records of incoming dispatches. The letter described 200,000 refugees on the northern bank. It requested permission for a mass crossing. It promised soldiers, farmers, loyal subjects. Valens read it. He consulted his advisors. And in this timeline, the one we are building tonight, he said no. The order that went back to the Danube frontier was blunt, the way Roman military orders tended to be. Reinforce the garrisons, double the river patrols, no crossings. Any attempt to ford the river would be met with force. The Goths were not Rome's problem. It was not a compassionate decision. We should be honest about that from the beginning. On the far bank of the Danube, families huddled in makeshift camps. Children cried through the night. The elderly died of exposure. Fritigern and Alavivus, the Gothic leaders who had sent the original petition, watched the Roman sentries lighting their signal fires on the opposite shore and understood that no help was coming. Behind them, the Huns continued their sweep westward. The sound of hooves on frozen ground, the smoke of burning Gothic villages rising against the winter sky. We do not know what Fritigern said to his people in those weeks after the refusal, but we can imagine the weight of it, a leader who had staked everything on Roman mercy, standing before thousands of desperate faces with nothing left to offer. Some Goths scattered north, into the deep forests of what is now Poland and the Czech Republic. Others turned west, following the Danube upstream, looking for unguarded crossings they would never find. The Roman engineers had spent 4 centuries building that frontier, and when it was properly manned, it was as close to impregnable as anything in the ancient world. Every 15 miles, a stone fort with walls 8 feet thick, housing a garrison of 500 men. Every 5 miles, a watchtower with a beacon ready to light. And between them, patrol boats moving constantly on the water, flat-bottomed galleys crewed by men who had grown up on the river, who knew every sandbar and every current. The garrison commanders along the Danube were career soldiers. Men like Flavius Lupicinus, not the corrupt Lupicinus of our timeline who starved the Goths for profit, but a different version of the same man, one who never had refugees to exploit and so spent his career doing what frontier officers were supposed to do, maintaining the wall. These men drilled their troops. They repaired the forts. They kept the signal fire chain operational from the Black Sea to the Alps. It was unglamorous, repetitive, essential work, and in this timeline, it mattered more than any battle ever fought. The Gothic refugees who remained near the Danube, those too old, too sick, or too stubborn to scatter, eventually settled into a grim equilibrium on the far bank. They built semi-permanent camps. They fished the river. They traded with Roman merchants who came to the frontier forts, exchanging furs and amber for grain and iron tools. It was not the life they had wanted. It was not Roman citizenship, not farmland, not safety, but it was survival. Within a generation, many of these Gothic communities had been absorbed into the broader patchwork of peoples north of the Danube. Their children spoke a mixture of Gothic and the local Germanic dialects. Their grandchildren forgot they had ever stood on the riverbank and begged to cross. The Great Gothic Migration, which in our timeline tore the empire apart, ended not with a bang, but with a quiet assimilation into the forests of Central Europe. The Huns reached the northern bank of the Danube by the spring of 377. They saw the same thing the Goths had seen, a wall of Roman steel on the far side. But the Huns were not refugees. They were conquerors. They tested the frontier at 3 points. At Aquincum, near modern Budapest, a force of roughly 3,000 Hun cavalry attempted a night crossing where the river narrows. Roman archers, positioned in towers with a clear line of sight, killed an estimated 400 before the rest turned back. At Singajunum, near modern Belgrade, a larger force tried to cross on improvised rafts. Roman river galleys, flat-bottomed warships designed specifically for the Danube, rammed and sank the rafts in the shallows. And at Novaeajunum, near the river's mouth at the Black Sea, a small raiding party did manage to get across. They burned 2 farms and killed 11 people before a Roman cavalry detachment rode them down. 3 attempts, 3 failures. The Huns were devastating in open-steppe warfare, but they had no siege capability, no naval tradition, and no experience fighting fortified river crossings. The Danube was not a steppe. It was a Roman weapon. By 380, the Huns had turned their attention elsewhere, south toward Persia, east toward the remnants of the Gothic kingdoms. The pressure on the Danube frontier eased. It did not disappear entirely. There would be border skirmishes for decades, but the existential threat, the one that in our timeline had cracked the empire open from the inside, simply never materialized. And here is where the story begins to diverge in ways that compound on each other. In our timeline, after Adrianople, the Roman army was shattered. Emperor Theodosius had to rebuild it almost from scratch, and to do so, he recruited the very Goths who had destroyed it. Within a generation, the Roman army in the West was a Gothic army in Roman uniforms. The generals were Gothic. The soldiers were Gothic. The loyalty was Gothic, which is to say, conditional. In this timeline, Adrianople never happens. The Eastern Roman army remains intact. 150,000 professional soldiers, the finest military force on Earth, with an unbroken chain of command stretching back to Augustus. Valens, unburdened by a catastrophic defeat, turns his attention back to the problem he had been planning to address all along: Persia. The war against the Sassanid Empire begins in 382. It goes better than anyone expected. Without the drain of a Gothic crisis, Valens commits the full Eastern Field Army, roughly 80,000 men, to the Mesopotamian frontier. The Sassanid king Shapur II, who had been preparing for a Roman attack, finds himself facing a force nearly twice the size he anticipated. The Roman army that crosses the Euphrates in the spring of 382 is not the depleted, demoralized force of our timeline. It is the Roman war machine at full strength, and it has not suffered a major defeat in living memory. The details of the campaign are beyond what we can know with certainty, but we know the ground. The Mesopotamian frontier runs through flat, dry terrain, perfect for the kind of set-piece infantry battles at which Rome excelled. The Sassanid advantage had always been their heavy cavalry, the famous cataphracts, armored riders on armored horses who could shatter an infantry line with a single charge. But a full-strength Roman army, properly deployed, had answered cavalry charges before. Marius had done it against the Cimbri. Caesar had done it against the Gauls. The Roman infantry square, shields locked and javelins ready, was the most resilient formation in the ancient world when the men inside it were disciplined, well-fed, and confident. And these men are all three. They have not lost a major battle. They have not watched their comrades butchered at Adrianople. They have not been told that Rome is weak. The trajectory is clear. A Rome that holds the Danube is a Rome that keeps its army. A Rome that keeps its army is a Rome that can project power. And a Rome that can project power in the late 4th century is a Rome that reshapes the map. Think about that for a moment. In our timeline, the 5th century was the century of collapse. City after city fell. Province after province was carved away. The light went out. In this timeline, the 5th century is about to become something entirely different. The Danube held. The cascade never started. And on the far side of that held line, a different world was already taking shape. One that would have been unrecognizable to the people huddled in the ruins of our actual history. We will see what that world looks like next. Chapter 3, the 5th Century Renaissance. In our timeline, the year 410 AD is the year Rome was sacked. Saint Jerome wept in Bethlehem. Refugees streamed out of the city carrying whatever they could hold. The Forum, which had been the center of the civilized world for 8 centuries, was looted by Visigoths who used the marble benches as hitching posts for their horses. In this timeline, the year 410 is the year the aqueduct at Colonia Agrippina, modern Cologne, is extended by 14 miles to supply a new industrial district on the Rhine. That single detail tells you everything about how far these two worlds have already diverged. In one, civilization is burning. In the other, it is building. The Western Empire, in this alternate 5th century, does not fall because the forces that destroyed it never arrive. There are no Visigoths in Gaul, no Vandals in North Africa, no Ostrogoths in Italy. The barbarian kingdoms that in our timeline replaced Roman provinces one by one simply do not exist, because the Gothic migration that set the entire chain in motion was stopped at the Danube in 376. This does not mean the Western Empire is healthy. It has deep structural problems, the same ones that historians have debated for centuries. Tax collection is inefficient. The senatorial aristocracy hoards wealth. The gap between rich and poor is staggering. The army is expensive. The bureaucracy is bloated. But here is what is different. In our timeline, these problems were fatal because they coincided with external invasion. A sick patient can survive a chronic illness for decades. What kills the patient is the illness plus a sword through the chest. Remove the sword, and the patient lives long enough to find a treatment. The treatment, in this case, comes from a man named Flavius Stilicho. In our actual history, Stilicho was the last great Roman general of the West, half Vandal by birth, Roman by training, and the most capable military commander of his generation. He spent 20 years holding the Western Empire together with inadequate resources and a government that actively undermined him. In 408, the Emperor Honorius, a man whose primary accomplishment was raising chickens, had Stilicho executed on false charges of treason. Within 2 years, Rome was sacked. In this timeline, Stilicho never has to fight a losing war against Gothic invaders. Instead, he does what he always wanted to do: reform the Western military and administrative system. The army is restructured along the lines that Diocletian had originally intended a century earlier. The tax system is overhauled. The senatorial estates in Gaul and Spain are brought, grudgingly, back under central authority. Picture Stilicho in this world. He is the same man, the same sharp military mind, the same political instincts, the same half-barbarian heritage that made him suspect to the Roman aristocracy. But instead of spending his nights planning defense against the next Gothic incursion, he is spending them reading reports from provincial tax collectors. Instead of requisitioning grain to feed a besieged city, he is requisitioning engineers to rebuild the road network in southern Gaul. It is a different kind of greatness, the kind that does not get statues. He dies in 423 in bed of a fever, an ordinary death for an extraordinary man. In our timeline, his headless body was dragged through the streets of Ravenna. In this one, he is buried with full honors in a marble tomb on the Appian Way, and his reforms outlive him by centuries. It is not glamorous work. No one writes epic poems about tax reform, but the numbers tell the story. By 430, Western imperial revenue has increased by roughly 40%. The army is smaller but better equipped, better paid, and, critically, composed entirely of professional Roman soldiers rather than barbarian mercenaries whose loyalty was always negotiable. And it is in this stabilized Western Empire that something remarkable begins to happen. The Romans had always been engineers. It was their defining characteristic as a civilization, not philosophy like the Greeks, not spiritual practice like the Egyptians, but the practical application of knowledge to physical problems. Roads, aqueducts, concrete, central heating, sewage systems. The Roman genius was not in the abstract, but in the material. In our timeline, that engineering tradition died with the empire. The last Roman aqueduct was built in the early 5th century. After that, the knowledge of how to survey land, calculate water pressure, mix concrete, and build arch structures slowly evaporated. It took Europe 1,000 years to rediscover what the Romans had known. In this timeline, the tradition never breaks. The aqueducts keep flowing. The concrete keeps being mixed. And most importantly, the engineers keep being trained, generation after generation, master to apprentice, in an unbroken chain of practical knowledge stretching back to Vitruvius. By the middle of the 5th century, Roman engineers begin doing something that our Romans never had the chance to do. They start improving. The key innovation comes from the water mills. Rome already had water mills in our timeline. The complex at Barbegal, near Arles in southern France, was a cascade of 16 overshot water wheels arranged on a hillside, grinding grain for the surrounding region. It was built around 300 AD and is sometimes called the first industrial complex in history. In our timeline, it was abandoned after the fall. The wheels rotted, the channels silted up. By 600, it was a ruin. In this timeline, Barbegal is not abandoned. It is expanded. By 450, Roman engineers have connected the water wheels not just to grain mills, but to sawmills, fulling mills for textile production. And this is the critical step, bellows for iron smelting. Water-powered bellows can maintain a constant, high-temperature blast of air into a furnace. This is something that human-powered bellows could never reliably achieve. The result is hotter furnaces, which means better iron, which means better tools, which means faster construction, which means more infrastructure, which means more water mills. It is a feedback loop, and feedback loops, once they start, are very difficult to stop. By 480, there are water-powered industrial complexes along every major river in the Western Empire. The Rhone, the Rhine, the Tiber, the Ebro. Each one is a cluster of workshops, metalworking, textile production, timber processing, grain milling, all driven by the same river that runs through them. The sound of these places would have been extraordinary. The constant rush of water, the rhythmic thud of trip hammers shaping iron, the whine of saw blades cutting timber. Not quiet. Not pastoral, industrial. If you had walked through one of these complexes in 490 AD, you would have seen something that in our timeline did not exist until the 1700s, a factory town. Workers living in rows of identical concrete apartments. Shifts running day and night. Standardized production of goods that were shipped across the empire on roads that still worked, to cities that still stood, for people who still had money to buy them. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. The year is 490. In our timeline, the last Western emperor was deposed 14 years ago. Europe is fragmenting into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. Literacy is collapsing. Cities are emptying. The recipe for concrete has been forgotten. And in this timeline, a Roman factory worker is clocking in for the night shift. The implications of this are so large that it is difficult to know where to begin. But we will start with the most obvious one. A Rome that industrializes in the 5th century is a Rome that does not need slave labor. This is not idealism. It is economics. Water-powered machinery is cheaper than slaves. It does not eat. It does not run away. It does not revolt. The economic logic of slavery, which had underpinned Roman civilization from the beginning, begins to erode the moment you can replace human muscle with a water wheel. The transition takes a century. Slavery does not vanish overnight, but by the year 500, the character of the Roman economy has fundamentally changed. It is still brutal, still hierarchical, still deeply unequal. But it is powered by water and iron rather than human suffering, and that difference, that single material difference, changes everything that comes after. The 5th century, in this timeline, is not a dark age. It is a renaissance. Not the Renaissance, that word belongs to a different story, one about rediscovering what was lost. This is something else entirely. This is a civilization that never lost anything, and is now building on a foundation that in our world was destroyed before the building could begin. What does this Roman world sound like at the turn of the 6th century? Stand in the city of Rome itself, population 1.2 million and growing. The Forum is still the political center of the world. Senators still debate in the Curia. But behind the marble facades, something has changed. You can hear it, the rush of water through aqueduct channels, louder than it used to be, because the channels have been widened to feed not just homes and baths, but the new mill complexes along the Tiber. You can smell it, the tang of hot iron from the workshops downstream, mixed with the old familiar sense of bread and olive oil and horse. You can see it in the faces of the people on the street, who are better fed, better clothed, and more numerous than they have ever been. This is the empire that was supposed to fall. It did not, and it is only getting started. Chapter 4: The Reconsolidation. There is a map that hangs in the British Museum. It is called the Tabula Peutingeriana, a medieval copy of a Roman road map drawn on a long strip of parchment, showing every major road, city, and way station in the empire. The scale is distorted. The Mediterranean looks like a river. Africa is a thin ribbon along the bottom, but the roads are there, every one of them, and they stretch from Britain in the west to India in the east. In our timeline, that map became a relic, a record of a world that no longer existed. The roads it depicted crumbled. The cities emptied. The way stations fell into ruin and were swallowed by forest. In this timeline, the map is still accurate. The 6th century opens with a unified Roman Empire facing a problem it has not had to deal with in a very long time: what to do with all its strength. The Danube frontier is secure. The western provinces are stable and industrializing. The army is professional, well-supplied, and restless. An army that has nothing to fight tends to create problems of its own. The answer, as it had been for centuries, is Persia. The Sassanid Empire, which stretches from Mesopotamia to the borders of India, is Rome's oldest and most sophisticated rival. The two empires have been fighting over the same strip of territory, the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates, since the 3rd century. Neither has ever been able to deliver a knockout blow. The wars are expensive, bloody, and inconclusive. But the Rome of the 6th century in this timeline is not the same Rome that fought Persia before. It is richer. Its army is better equipped, supplied by water-powered factories that can produce standardized weapons, armor, and equipment at a scale no pre-industrial state has ever achieved. And it has something the Sassanids do not: concrete. Roman concrete, specifically. The mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater that the Romans perfected in the 2nd century BC, and that in our timeline was lost after the fall. This concrete could be poured underwater. It could set in any weather. It grew stronger with age. The Pantheon's dome, poured in 125 AD, is harder today than when it was built. And in this timeline, Roman engineers have been refining the formula for 6 unbroken centuries. The Sassanid frontier, which had always been a line of forts and watchtowers similar to the Danube, is now transformed into something far more permanent. Roman engineers build a continuous concrete wall across the northern Mesopotamian plain, 280 miles long, 12 feet high, with a garrison fort every 10 miles. They call it the Limes Persicus. It takes 20 years to build and consumes enough concrete to pave every road in Britain. Behind that wall, the Roman army stages its campaign. The war begins in 534 under Emperor Marcian II, a name that does not exist in our timeline because the dynasty he belongs to was never born. Marcian is a competent rather than brilliant commander, which, in the Roman military tradition, is often more useful. He does not seek a single decisive battle. He applies pressure. Roman forces advance along 3 axes. In the north, through Armenia. In the center, across the Euphrates toward Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital. In the south, through the desert with a supply chain that would have been impossible without the industrial capacity of the reformed western provinces. Each army carries standardized equipment produced in the factories of Gaul and transported along roads that have been maintained without interruption for 6 centuries. The Sassanid King Kavad II fights brilliantly. His cavalry is still the finest in the world, heavily armored cataphracts who can break any infantry formation head-on. But the Roman army of the 6th century is not the army of the 3rd. It has adapted. Water-powered crossbow workshops in the Rhineland produce thousands of heavy crossbows that can penetrate cataphract armor at 200 yards. The crossbow is not a new invention. The Romans had them in the 1st century, but mass production changes its military significance entirely. A weapon that was once a curiosity becomes a standard-issue battlefield tool. The war lasts 8 years. Ctesiphon falls in 542. The Sassanid dynasty does not collapse. That kind of total defeat is rare in the ancient world, but it is forced to cede the entire Tigris Valley to Rome. For the first time, Roman territory extends to the Persian Gulf. And it is the Persian Gulf that changes everything. Because beyond the Gulf lies the Indian Ocean, and beyond the Indian Ocean lies China. Rome had always traded with the East. Silk, spices, precious stones, and exotic animals flowed westward along the Silk Road, passing through Parthian and later Sassanid middlemen who controlled the routes and took a cut of every transaction. Roman merchants rarely traveled the full distance themselves. They did not need to. The goods came to them, marked up at every stage. But with direct access to the Persian Gulf, Roman ships can now sail east. And Roman ships in the 6th century are excellent lateen-rigged Mediterranean vessels that can sail close to the wind, built by shipyards that have been in continuous operation for 7 centuries. Within a decade of the conquest, Roman merchants establish a permanent trading post at the mouth of the Indus River. Within 2 decades, they have reached the coast of Sri Lanka. The goods that flow back are extraordinary, not just silk and spices, but knowledge. Indian mathematics, the decimal system, the concept of zero, the foundations of algebra, Chinese papermaking, techniques for producing steel that exceed anything Roman metallurgy has yet achieved. I have spent a long time thinking about what this moment means, the moment when Roman engineering tradition meets Indian mathematical innovation without the 1,000-year interruption of the Dark Ages. In our timeline, these 2 knowledge systems did eventually combine. It happened slowly, painfully, through Arabic intermediaries during the medieval period, and it took centuries to bear fruit. The result was the scientific revolution. In this timeline, the combination happens in the 6th century. And it happens not through fragile chains of translation and transmission, but through direct contact, Roman engineers and Indian mathematicians working in the same trading posts, solving the same practical problems, speaking a pidgin of Latin and Sanskrit that develops along the Malabar coast. The Roman numeral system, clumsy, beautiful, and terrible for calculation, begins to be replaced by Indian numerals in commercial documents by 580. By 600, the great engineering academies in Rome and Alexandria have adopted the new system entirely. The effect is like giving a master carpenter a power tool. Everything that was possible before is suddenly easier, faster, and more precise. Try this yourself. Multiply 347 by 89 using Roman numerals. CCCXLVII times LXXXIX, you cannot do it. The system was not built for calculation, it was built for recording. To multiply in Roman numerals, you needed an abacus, a trained calculator, and time. To multiply in Indian numerals, you need a flat surface and a stick to write with. The difference is not academic. It is the difference between an engineering culture that can design by rule of thumb and one that can design by precise computation. It is the difference between a bridge that stands because the builder's grandfather's bridge stood, and a bridge that stands because someone calculated the load, the stress, the wind resistance, and the tensile strength of every beam before a single stone was laid. The 6th century, in this timeline, is not the age of Justinian's doomed reconquest or the devastating plague of Justinian that killed perhaps half the empire's population. The plague still comes. It is carried by rats on grain ships from Egypt, and no amount of Roman engineering can stop a flea. But it strikes an empire that is wealthy, unified, and industrializing. The death toll is terrible, perhaps 30 million across the empire. But the recovery is faster, because the infrastructure to rebuild is intact. By 600, the Roman Empire stretches from Britain to the Persian Gulf. Its population is roughly 90 million. Its road network covers 250,000 miles. Its aqueducts deliver fresh water to 2,000 cities. And its engineers, armed with Indian mathematics and 6 centuries of unbroken tradition, are about to enter an age of invention that will make everything that came before look like a prologue. What that age produces is something we need a new chapter to describe. Chapter 5: The Age of Mechanism. In the ruins of a Roman villa in southern France, archaeologists once found a bronze gear. It was small, about the size of a coin, with teeth cut so precisely that modern machinists have struggled to replicate them. It was part of something, a device, a mechanism, but the rest was gone, melted down, or lost to the centuries, and we will never know what it did. This happens again and again in Roman archaeology. Fragments of sophistication that imply a larger whole we cannot see. The Antikythera mechanism, a Greek-built, Roman-era analog computer found in a shipwreck off Crete, could predict eclipses, track the Olympic Games, and model the motion of 5 planets using a system of interlocking bronze gears. It was built around 100 BC. Nothing of comparable complexity would be built in Europe for another 1,400 years. In our timeline, the Antikythera mechanism is an orphan, a dead end. The tradition that produced it, Greek mathematical theory combined with Roman precision manufacturing, died with the empire. The knowledge of how to cut gears, build differential mechanisms, and calibrate astronomical instruments was not written down in any surviving text. It lived in the hands of craftsmen, and when the craftsmen died without apprentices, it was gone. In this timeline, the craftsmen never stopped teaching. The 7th century, the 600s, to anchor us, opens with Roman engineering academies in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Carthage, training a new generation of mechanici. These are not philosophers or theorists. They are practical men and women who work with bronze and iron, who smell of machine oil and metal filings, whose hands are calloused from turning lathes. They are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back to Archimedes, through Ctesibius, through Hero of Alexandria, and they have never been interrupted. Hero of Alexandria is the key figure here, and I need you to understand why. Hero lived in the 1st century AD. He was a mathematician and engineer who worked at the Great Library in Alexandria, and he invented, among many other things, the eolipile. This was a hollow metal sphere mounted on a pivot with 2 bent nozzles on opposite sides. You filled it with water, heated it over a fire, and as the steam escaped through the nozzles, the sphere spun. Fast, visibly, impressively fast. It was the world's first steam engine, in the 1st century. In our timeline, the eolipile was a toy, a curiosity, a demonstration piece for wealthy patrons who wanted to see something clever at a dinner party. Nobody, not Hero, not his students, not anyone for the next 17 centuries, connected the spinning sphere to the idea of useful work. The steam engine had to be reinvented from scratch by Thomas Newcomen in 1712, in a country that had forgotten Rome had ever existed. Why did the Romans not develop the steam engine? This is one of the great counterfactual questions of history, and the usual answer is slavery. Why invest in labor-saving machinery when you have an unlimited supply of human beings who work for free? The economics of slavery killed the incentive to innovate. But in this timeline, we removed that obstacle in the 5th century. Water-powered industry made slavery economically obsolete. And the generation of engineers trained in the early 7th century, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the first factory workers, are thinking about power in a fundamentally different way than their ancestors did. They are thinking about it the way Thomas Newcomen thought about it, not as a curiosity, as a tool. The breakthrough happens in 643 in a watermill complex on the Tiber River, 20 miles upstream from Rome. An engineer whose name the records give as Gaius Petronius Mechanicus, and that last name tells you something about how Roman society has changed, that Mechanicus is now a family name worth carrying, is trying to solve a specific problem. The water level in the Tiber drops every summer. When it drops, the mills slow down. When the mills slow down, production falls. He needs a way to keep the mills running when the river is low. His solution is to build a closed vessel, fill it with water, heat it with a coal fire, and use the resulting steam pressure to push a piston connected to the mill's drive shaft. It is crude. It is inefficient. It leaks. The seals, made of leather and wax, fail constantly, but it works. When the Tiber runs low, the steam piston takes over and the mills keep turning. Think about that. The year is 643. In our timeline, this is the middle of the Dark Ages. The city of Rome has a population of roughly 30,000. The Forum is a cow pasture. The Colosseum is a quarry. And in Britain, the Anglo-Saxons are building wooden huts on top of Roman ruins they cannot explain. In this timeline, a Roman engineer has just built a working steam piston to supplement a water-powered factory. The device spreads slowly at first. The early versions are expensive, unreliable, and dangerous. Steam under pressure has a tendency to explode when the containment fails, and several workers die in the first decade. But the engineering academies attack the problem with the same systematic approach they have applied to everything else for 7 centuries. Better seals, stronger vessels, pressure relief valves. By 670, the steam auxiliary engine is standard equipment in every major industrial complex in the empire. And then someone does the obvious thing. Someone disconnects the steam engine from the water mill and asks, what if this could work on its own? The first standalone steam engine is built in 681 in the iron works at Aquae Suli's modern Bath in the province of Britannia. It is a beam engine, almost identical in principle to the Newcomen engine that would not exist in our timeline for another 1,000 years. It pumps water out of a mine. The mine produces coal. The coal feeds the engine. The engine pumps the water. The mine produces more coal. It is another feedback loop. And this one is far more powerful than the watermill cycle of the 5th century because it is not limited by geography. A watermill needs a river. A steam engine needs fuel. And fuel, wood, charcoal, coal can be found almost anywhere. I almost left this part out because the parallel to our own industrial revolution is so neat that it feels manufactured. But the logic is sound. Remove the Dark Ages. Maintain the engineering tradition. Give that tradition access to Indian mathematics and Persian metallurgy. The steam engine is not a miracle. It is an inevitability. And consider what the Aquae Suli's engine means for the people who built it. The engineer who designed it, we do not have a name. The records from the Britannia provinces in this period are sparse. Was not a genius in the way we think of Thomas Newcomen or James Watt. He was a competent professional solving a practical problem with the tools his training had given him. The beam engine was not his eureka moment. It was his Tuesday afternoon. That is the real power of an unbroken engineering tradition. Innovation stops being heroic and becomes routine. By 700, there are steam engines operating in every province of the empire. They pump water, drive bellows, power hammers, and, in one remarkable installation in Alexandria, turn a crankshaft connected to a set of grinding wheels that can polish optical glass to a precision that will matter enormously in a few centuries. The Roman world at the turn of the 8th century is loud. That is the detail I keep coming back to. For all of prior human history, the dominant sounds of daily life were natural, wind, water, animals, human voices. In this timeline, by 700, the dominant sound in any major Roman city is mechanical. The hiss of steam, the clang of hammers, the rhythmic thud of pistons. The rumble of wheels on stone roads, carrying goods produced in quantities that no pre-industrial civilization in our timeline ever imagined. It is not a gentle world. It is not a quiet world, but it is a world that works, and it is about to encounter something on its eastern frontier that will transform it yet again. Chapter 6: The Eastern Horizon. In our timeline, the Prophet Muhammad was born around 570 AD into a world shaped by the ruins of Rome. The Arabian Peninsula sat between two exhausted empires, the Byzantine rump of Rome in the west and Sassanid Persia in the east, both weakened by centuries of war, plague, and internal collapse. The power vacuum was real. The space for a new force to emerge was wide open. In this timeline, that space does not exist. The Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century still sits between two great powers. But in this version of history, one of those powers is not weakened. It is the strongest it has ever been. The Roman Empire of the 7th century, unified, industrializing, and projecting force from Britain to the Persian Gulf, casts a shadow over Arabia that the fragmented Byzantine state of our history never could. Muhammad is still born. The revelation still comes. Islam still emerges as a spiritual and social force in the early 7th century because the conditions that gave rise to it, the corruption of the old polytheistic traditions, the influence of Jewish and Christian monotheism, the desire for social justice in a deeply stratified tribal society, are not dependent on Roman politics. They are local. They are human. They are, in a word, inevitable. But what happens next is very different. In our timeline, the early Islamic conquests were among the most rapid and complete military campaigns in human history. Within 20 years of Muhammad's death in 632, Arab armies had conquered the entire Sassanid Empire, seized Egypt and Syria from Byzantium, and controlled a territory stretching from Libya to Afghanistan. Within a century, the Umayyad Caliphate ruled from Spain to the Indus River. The conquests succeeded because both Rome and Persia were exhausted. Their armies were depleted. Their treasuries were empty. Their populations were demoralized by plague and decades of inconclusive warfare. The Arab armies rode into a vacuum. In this timeline, there is no vacuum. The first major clash comes in 636, the same year as the Battle of Yarmouk in our history, when Arab forces shattered the Byzantine army in Syria. In this timeline, the Roman army that meets the Arab advance at the Syrian frontier is not a depleted garrison force. It is a full-strength legion, equipped with mass-produced crossbows, supported by steam-powered supply trains, and backed by the industrial capacity of an empire that has been building for 2 unbroken centuries. The battle is brutal. The Arab cavalry is fast, motivated, and tactically brilliant, qualities that in our timeline allowed them to destroy far larger forces. But they are fighting an enemy that they have never encountered before. An enemy with standardized equipment, disciplined formations, and weapons that can kill at ranges the Arab commanders have never experienced. The Roman frontier holds, not easily, not without cost, but it holds. What happens after is more interesting than the battle itself. Because the Arab expansion does not simply stop, it redirects. The energy of early Islam, that extraordinary combination of spiritual conviction, social reform, and military ambition, does not disappear just because Rome is too strong to conquer. It flows south into the Horn of Africa, east into Persia and Central Asia, territories that Rome has weakened but not fully absorbed. And it flows inward, into the intellectual and cultural development that in our timeline produced one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. The House of Wisdom. In our timeline, the House of Wisdom was established in Baghdad in the early 9th century by the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun. It was a library, a translation center, and a research institute, a place where scholars translated the works of Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, and Ptolemy from Greek into Arabic, preserving knowledge that Europe had lost. For 2 centuries, it was the intellectual center of the world. Islamic scholars did not merely preserve Greek knowledge, they advanced it. Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra. Ibn al-Haytham laid the foundations of modern optics. Al-Razi wrote medical encyclopedias that were used in European universities for 500 years. In this timeline, the House of Wisdom still exists, but it has a counterpart. The Great Library of Alexandria, which in our timeline was destroyed, possibly multiple times, the details are maddeningly unclear, never falls. In this timeline, it has been in continuous operation for 1,000 years. Its collection, which was already the largest in the ancient world, has grown with every century. By 750, it holds an estimated 800,000 scrolls and codices, a number that in our timeline would not be matched by any single institution until the modern era. And it is not just a repository, it is a working research institution. The same engineering academies that produced the steam engine are connected to the library. Knowledge flows in both directions: theoretical mathematics from the scholars, practical applications from the engineers. It is the world's first research university, and it has been operating without interruption since the Ptolemies founded it in the 3rd century BC. When Roman scholars and Arab scholars begin to exchange ideas, and they do, because trade does not stop at borders, and neither does curiosity, the result is not the slow, fragmentary transmission of our timeline. It is a collision. Roman engineering meets Arabic mathematics in the trading ports of the Red Sea. The Indian numeral system, which Rome adopted in the 6th century, is already common ground. Both traditions have been working on the same problems: optics, astronomy, medicine, mechanics, from different angles. When they compare notes, the results are immediate. An Arab mathematician named Al-Hasan, working in a Roman trading post on the coast of Yemen around 790, combines Roman lens grinding techniques with his own work on the behavior of light. The result is the first true telescope, a device that in our timeline would not be invented until 1608 by a Dutch spectacle maker named Hans Lippershey. Al-Hasan points his telescope at Jupiter and sees 4 small points of light that move from night to night. He does not know what they are. He records them carefully and sends his observations to both the House of Wisdom and the Library of Alexandria. What would you have done in that moment? Standing on a rooftop in Yemen, looking through a bronze tube at something no human being has ever seen before, 4 tiny lights orbiting a distant wanderer. What would you have felt? We do not know what Al-Hasan felt. The records do not say, but we know what happened next. Within a decade, telescopes are being manufactured in every major city in both the Roman Empire and the Islamic world. And the universe, which for all of human history had been a bowl of fixed stars turning overhead, cracks open. The implications take a century to sink in, but the observation is made. The door is open. And on both sides of the Roman-Arab frontier, 2 great civilizations are about to enter an age of discovery that neither could have achieved alone. This is the detail that made me fall in love with this story. Not the armies, not the empires, not the Industrial Revolution that came 1,000 years early. It is the image of a man on a rooftop in Yemen, Muslim and mathematician, using a Roman lens to see something that changes everything. The best things in human history have always happened at the borders, the places where different ways of thinking collide and produce something neither side expected. In this timeline, the border between Rome and Islam is not a scar. It is a seam, and what grows along that seam will reshape the world. But the cultural exchange is not only scientific. Arabic poetry, with its complex meters, its tradition of oral performance, its sophisticated use of metaphor and allusion, enters the Roman literary world through the same trading ports that carry mathematical treatises. Roman dramatists, who have maintained an unbroken theatrical tradition stretching back to Plautus, begin incorporating Arabic verse forms into their work. Arabic musicians encounter Roman hydraulic organs, instruments powered by water pressure that produce sounds unlike anything in the Eastern tradition. And the fusion that results is a new kind of music that belongs to neither culture alone. This is what happens when civilizations meet as equals or near equals. Not the one-sided extraction of colonialism, not the terrified misunderstanding of first contact, but a genuine exchange between peoples who have different things to offer and the curiosity to learn from each other. It is rare in our history. In this timeline, it is the defining feature of the 8th century, and it produces wonders that neither side could have imagined alone. Chapter 7: The Carbon Century. There is a place in northern England, in what the Romans called Britannia, where coal seams run so close to the surface that they have been burning since before recorded history. The Romans knew about them. They mined coal at sites across Britain. We have found the slag heaps, the tools, the cart tracks worn into the rock. They used it mostly for heating bathhouses and smelting iron. It was dirty, it was smelly, and wood was usually cheaper. In this timeline, wood is no longer cheaper. 8 centuries of continuous Roman civilization have done something that our Dark Ages accidentally reversed. They have consumed the forests. The great woodlands of Gaul, which Caesar described as stretching unbroken for hundreds of miles, have been systematically harvested for shipbuilding, construction, charcoal production, and fuel. Britain's forests are similarly depleted. The Mediterranean has been largely deforested since the Republican era. By the year 800, the Roman Empire faces an energy crisis. The steam engines that have transformed industry over the past century and a half run on fuel. The factories run on fuel. The smelters run on fuel. And fuel, specifically wood and charcoal, is running out. The solution is underfoot, literally underfoot, and the empire's most unlikely province is about to become its most important. Britannia, the cold, rain-soaked island at the northwestern edge of the known world that Julius Caesar first invaded in 55 BC, and that every subsequent emperor regarded as a minor, expensive, somewhat embarrassing possession. Britannia, which produced tin and wool and not much else that Romans cared about. Britannia, which in our timeline was abandoned by Rome around 410 AD, the legions recalled, the cities left to decay, the population reverting to a subsistence economy that would last for centuries. In this timeline, Britannia is not abandoned. It has been a functioning Roman province for over 800 years, and beneath its soggy fields and rolling hills lie the largest accessible coal deposits in Western Europe. Coal mining in Britain accelerates dramatically in the early 9th century. The Romans had always known the coal was there, but they had never needed it badly enough to dig deep for it. Now they do. Mining engineers, trained in the same academy system that produced the steam engine, develop shaft mining techniques that allow them to reach coal seams 200 feet below the surface. Steam-powered pumps keep the mines dry. Steam-powered lifts haul the coal to the surface. And steam-powered rail carts, running on iron tracks laid along the old Roman roads, carry it to the ports. The numbers are staggering. By 850, British coal mines are producing an estimated 3 million tons per year. For comparison, Britain in our timeline did not reach that level of coal production until roughly 1700. The Roman Empire is 9 centuries ahead of our schedule and accelerating. And here is where I need to be honest about something. The further we travel into this alternate timeline, the harder it becomes to predict with confidence. We are now 450 years past the point of divergence. The butterfly effects have compounded into hurricanes. Every choice I make about what happens next is speculative, grounded in real principles of economics, engineering, and human behavior, but speculative nonetheless. What I can tell you is what coal does to a civilization, because we have seen it in our own history. Coal is energy. Dense, portable, abundant energy. A pound of coal contains roughly 3 times the energy of a pound of wood. A coal mine, once operational, produces fuel continuously, regardless of season, weather, or the growth rate of trees. And a civilization with abundant coal can do things that a civilization running on wood and water simply cannot. It can smelt steel, not iron steel. The difference matters enormously. Iron is soft, relatively speaking. It bends, it rusts, it fatigues. Steel is harder, stronger, more flexible, and more durable. In our timeline, high-quality steel production was limited to small batches produced by skilled smiths until the Bessemer process of 1856 made mass production possible. In this timeline, Roman engineers have been refining their metallurgy for nearly a millennium. They know about carbon content. They know about tempering. And they have coal-fired furnaces that can reach temperatures their wood-fired predecessors never could. By 870, Roman steel foundries in Britain are producing structural steel beams, not wrought iron bars hammered into shape. Cast and rolled steel beams, uniform in cross-section, strong enough to span distances that stone and timber cannot. The implications for construction are immediate. Roman concrete, which has been the building material of choice for 9 centuries, now has a partner. Steel-reinforced concrete structures begin appearing in Roman cities, taller, lighter, and stronger than anything built before. The first building to exceed 10 stories, roughly 120 feet, is constructed in Londinium around 885. It is an administrative building for the Provincial Mining Authority, and it is built to impress. Steel frame, concrete walls, glass windows on every floor, glass being another product that mass production has made cheap and abundant. The building has steam-powered lifts, running water on every floor, and a heating system that pipes steam from a coal-fired boiler in the basement through hollow walls. In our timeline, the first steel-framed building was the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, built in 1885. The parallel is exact, 1,000 years apart. What does the Londinium skyline look like in 890? Close your eyes and picture a Roman city, the Forum, the bathhouse, the amphitheater, the low-rise brick and concrete buildings lining straight streets. Now stretch it upward. The old Roman core is still there, the original grid laid out by Claudius's engineers in the 1st century. But rising above it, concentrated near the river docks and the railway terminus, are steel and glass towers that would not look out of place in 1920s Manhattan. 12 stories, 15 stories, smoke from 100 chimneys drifting between them. The old Londinium Bridge, rebuilt in steel, carries not just foot traffic and carts, but a double-track railway line connecting the city center to the coal fields of the north. The Thames below is thick with barges carrying coal, steel, manufactured goods. The lifeblood of an industrial economy, a millennium ahead of schedule. I want to tell you something else about the coal mines, because it matters for understanding what kind of world this is. Mining is dangerous. It was dangerous in our timeline, and it is dangerous in this one. Collapses, flooding, gas explosions, lung disease. The Roman miners of the 9th century are not slaves. Slavery has been economically marginal for 3 centuries, but they are poor. They work 12-hour shifts in tunnels that are hot, dark, and sometimes lethally toxic. They die young. Their children follow them underground because the alternatives are worse. Roman law, which has evolved continuously for over 1,000 years, provides some protections. Mining companies, and yes, they are companies, organized under Roman corporate law that predates our concept of the corporation by centuries, are required to ventilate their shafts, shore their tunnels, and compensate families of workers killed on the job. These protections are imperfect. They are often ignored. But they exist, which is more than can be said for the coal mines of Victorian England. This is not a utopia we are building. It is a real civilization, with real costs and real suffering. The difference between this world and our own is not that it is better in some moral sense. The difference is that the suffering is happening 900 years sooner, which means the solutions, labor laws, safety regulations, environmental protections, also have 900 years longer to develop. By the year 900, the Roman Empire burns more coal than our entire world did in 1700. The sky over Londinium, over the factory towns of Gaul, over the steelworks of the Rhineland, is tinged with smoke. The rivers near industrial centers run dark with waste. The air tastes of sulfur. If you had stood on a hill outside Londinium in 900 AD and looked down at the city, you would have seen something that looked remarkably like Manchester in 1840. a forest of chimneys, a haze of coal smoke, the glint of steel and glass where once there was only stone and timber, and the sound, the constant, rhythmic, mechanical sound of a world being built. The carbon century has begun, and what it builds next will require its own chapter to describe. Chapter 8, The First Factories. The Roman road from Londinium to Aquae Sulis runs almost perfectly straight for 105 miles. It was built in the 1st century AD, and in this timeline, it has been maintained continuously for 800 years. But by the year 920, the road carries something its builders never imagined. Iron rails. The concept is simple. Lay 2 parallel strips of iron along a flat surface. Put wheels with flanged edges on a cart. The cart rolls with almost no friction, following the rails wherever they lead. In our timeline, the first iron rail lines appeared in English coal mines in the early 1600s, horse-drawn wagons on tracks, moving coal from the minehead to the river. In this timeline, the same logic applies, but the wagons are not pulled by horses. They are pushed by steam. The first steam-powered rail vehicle runs on the Londinium Aquae Sulis road in 923. It is not fast, roughly 8 miles per hour, about the speed of a trotting horse. It is not elegant. It is a converted road engine, a squat iron boiler on wheels, belching smoke and clanging over joints in the track. But it pulls 12 loaded wagons behind it, carrying 40 tons of coal, a load that would require 60 horse-drawn carts on an ordinary road. Within 20 years, rail lines connect every major city in Britannia. Within 50 years, they cross the Channel. The Romans built a bridge across the Strait of Dover in the 4th century, one of their most ambitious engineering projects, and it is wide enough to carry double tracks and extend into Gaul. By 1000, there are 15,000 miles of rail in the empire. Picture the journey. You board a steam-hauled train at the Londinium terminus, a vaulted steel and glass structure that dwarfs any cathedral in our medieval timeline. The locomotive is iron and brass, hissing gently, wreathed in steam. You sit on a wooden bench in a passenger car with glass windows, a material that in our 10th century is a luxury reserved for churches. The whistle sounds. The train jolts forward, and within minutes, the smoking chimneys of Londinium are falling behind you. The route follows the old Roman road south through Cantium, Kent, past hop fields and orchards, and the occasional cluster of factory buildings, their chimneys adding to the permanent haze that hangs over the southern counties. You cross the Dover Bridge, a structure of concrete piers and steel spans that the Roman engineers completed in 871 after a construction project that took 30 years and consumed 40,000 tons of steel. The Channel water churns gray-green below. On the far side, Gaul, the train does not stop. It rolls onto the continental network and continues south, through the factory towns of northern Gaul, past the vineyards of Burgundy, and into the heart of the empire. If you rode this train all the way to Rome, a journey of roughly 1,200 miles, it would take you about 5 days. In our 10th century, the same journey on horseback, assuming the roads existed at all, would take 2 months. But the rail network, impressive as it is not the most important development of the 10th century. That distinction belongs to something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more consequential. The printing press. In our timeline, Johannes Gutenberg built his movable type printing press around 1440. It was revolutionary, the single most transformative invention in human history, according to many scholars. Before Gutenberg, a book was a handwritten artifact, produced by months of labor, owned only by the wealthy and the church. After Gutenberg, a book was a manufactured product, identical copies stamped out by the thousands, affordable to anyone who could read. The Romans had all the pieces. They had movable type individual letter stamps used to mark pottery, bricks, and official documents. They had the screw press, used for wine and olive oil production, and identical in basic mechanism to Gutenberg's press. They had ink. They had paper, or rather papyrus, which is not quite the same thing but serves the same function. And they had literacy rates that, in the urban centers at least, were far higher than medieval Europe's. What they did not have, in our timeline, was the incentive. With slavery to provide cheap copyists, and with a small elite audience for written works, the economics of mass production never justified the investment. In this timeline, the incentive exists. The Roman Empire of the 10th century has a large, literate, urban population. It has an industrial economy that runs on standardized information, technical manuals, engineering specifications, legal codes, commercial contracts. It has a postal service that still functions. And it has a paper industry. Chinese paper-making techniques arrived via the Eastern trade routes in the 7th century that can produce cheap, uniform sheets in quantity. The printing press is invented in Rome in 937 by a woman named Lucia Fabricia, who runs a workshop producing stamped metal labels for the wine trade. The sources describe her as the daughter of a coin die cutter and the wife of a screw press manufacturer, which means she lived at the exact intersection of the two technologies that printing requires. Whether this is historical or mythologized, in the way that all founding stories tend to be, the timeline checks out. The first printed book is a copy of Virgil's Aeneid. Of course it is. The Aeneid has been the foundational text of Roman civilization for 1,000 years. Every schoolchild reads it. Every library owns it. It is the obvious choice for a first commercial print run, and the 500 copies sell out in a week. By 950, there are printing workshops in every major city. By 970, the price of a book has dropped to roughly 1/20th of the handwritten equivalent. By 1000, the empire produces an estimated 5 million printed volumes per year. The effects are exactly what you would expect if you know what happened after Gutenberg. Information travels faster. Technical knowledge, previously locked in guild workshops and engineering academies, becomes widely available. A farmer in Hispania can read the same agricultural manual as a farmer in Syria. A metalworker in Gaul can study the same techniques as a metalworker in Alexandria. Standards rise. Innovation accelerates. And critically, ideas that challenge the established order can no longer be suppressed by controlling access to manuscripts. There is a religious dimension to this that I need to mention because it matters. Christianity has been the official religion of the Roman Empire since the 4th century, and in this timeline, it remains so. But a Christianity that grows within a stable, industrializing empire develops very differently from the Christianity of our medieval period. There are no dark ages to produce the monasteries that preserved learning. There is no feudal system to create the political structures that gave the medieval church its temporal power. The church in this timeline is influential, but not supreme. It is one institution among many in a complex, urban, literate society. The printing press changes the religious landscape the same way it changed it in our timeline after Luther. Dissenting voices, which previously could be silenced by confiscating manuscripts, can now distribute their ideas to thousands of readers overnight. By the late 10th century, the Roman Empire is experiencing something like a reformation, a fragmentation of Christian unity into competing interpretations, each supported by a flood of printed pamphlets, commentaries, and counter-commentaries. It is messy, it is contentious, and it is, from a certain angle, beautiful, because it means that the intellectual life of the empire is alive in a way that a monolithic state religion could never produce. The factories, meanwhile, have evolved beyond recognition. The water-powered workshops of the 5th century were impressive. The steam-powered installations of the 8th century were transformative. But the factories of the 10th century are something else entirely. Vast complexes of steel and concrete, lit by gas lamps so that production can continue through the night, employing thousands of workers who produce standardized goods at a speed and volume that would have been incomprehensible to a Roman of the classical era. A textile factory in Lugdunum, modern Lyon, in the year 980 employs 2,400 workers operating 600 steam-powered looms. It produces 30,000 yards of cloth per day. The same output, using hand looms, would have required 12,000 workers and a month of labor. The cloth is cheaper, more uniform, and available in quantities that make it accessible to every class of Roman society. The toga, that ancient symbol of Roman citizenship, is now a mass-produced garment available in any market for a few copper coins. The human cost of this productivity is real. The factories are loud, the clatter of looms, the hiss of steam, the grinding of gears. The air inside is thick with fiber dust that coats the lungs and shortens lives. Children work alongside adults because the empire's child labor laws, while more advanced than anything in our medieval period, still permit work from the age of 10. The factory towns are crowded, often squalid, choked with the smoke that pours from 100 chimneys. And yet the workers in these factories are free. They are paid. They can leave. They can, in theory and sometimes in practice, organize and petition for better conditions. The Roman legal tradition, which has been developing for over 1,500 years by this point, provides frameworks for labor disputes, workplace safety requirements, and collective bargaining that in our timeline did not emerge until the 19th century. The system is imperfect. It is often unjust. But it is a system, and systems can be reformed. If you are still with me at this hour, you are the kind of person who needs to know how this ends. By the year 1000, the Roman Empire is an industrial civilization. Steam engines drive its factories, rail lines connect its cities, printed books fill its libraries, steel and concrete shape its skyline. Its population exceeds 120 million. Its economy, measured in modern terms, roughly matches Europe's in the mid-18th century. And across the ocean, an ocean that Roman ships have been charting for decades, lies a continent that the empire is about to discover. Or rather, a continent whose people are about to discover the empire. Chapter 9, The New World. Roman ships had been sailing the Atlantic for centuries. The route from Hispania to the Canary Islands was a standard commercial run. Fishing fleets worked the waters off the coast of Morocco and the Azores. And Roman navigators, trained in the astronomical tradition that combined Greek theory with Arab mathematics, could calculate latitude with an accuracy that in our timeline would not be matched until the 18th century. The crossing happens not because someone sets out to discover a new world, but because a storm pushes a merchant convoy off course. In the autumn of 1023, a fleet of 6 Roman cargo ships bound from the Canary Islands to Britannia, carrying wine, dried fish, and dyed textiles, encounters a storm system that drives them west for 11 days. When the wind drops, the navigator on the lead ship, a man named Marcus Valerius Nata, takes a star reading and realizes they have been pushed roughly 2,500 miles from their last known position. They are far beyond any charted waters. They sail west-southwest because the wind favors it, and on the 12th day they sight land. The coast they reach is what we would call the Caribbean, specifically the island of Hispaniola. The same island where Columbus made landfall 469 years later in our timeline. The parallels are structural, not coincidental. The Atlantic trade winds push westward in the tropics. Any ship caught in them long enough will end up in roughly the same place. But what happens on the beach is entirely different. When Columbus arrived in 1492, he represented a civilization that had spent 1,000 years in fragmentation, war, and religious absolutism. The Reconquista, the centuries-long war to expel the Moors from Spain, had just ended. The Inquisition was in full operation. Columbus carried with him a set of assumptions about the relationship between Christian Europeans and non-Christian peoples that would shape and devastate every encounter that followed. Marcus Valerius carries different assumptions. He is a citizen of a state that has been absorbing foreign peoples for 1,600 years. Roman law, the legal framework of his civilization, has robust concepts of citizenship, treaty rights, and the legal status of foreign nations. The Romans did not treat conquered peoples as equals. That would be absurd to claim. They were conquerors and often brutal ones, but they had a system, a framework. A legal mechanism for extending rights, negotiating relationships, and incorporating outsiders into the structure of the state. More importantly, Marcus Valerius does not carry smallpox. This requires explanation, because it is the single most consequential detail in this entire story. In our timeline, the encounter between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of the Americas was catastrophic primarily because of disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and a dozen other pathogens, to which Europeans had centuries of exposure and partial immunity, devastated populations that had never encountered them. Estimates vary, but the most careful demographic studies suggest that between 80 and 95% of the indigenous population of the Americas died of Old World diseases within a century of contact. Some regions lost 99% of their people. It was the largest demographic catastrophe in human history. In this timeline, smallpox still exists. The question is whether the pattern of contact is different enough to change the outcome. The answer, I believe, is partially yes, and the reason is speed. In our timeline, the Spanish conquest was rapid, violent, and comprehensive. Within 50 years of Columbus, Cortés had destroyed the Aztec Empire, and Pizarro had destroyed the Inca Empire. Disease ran ahead of the conquistadors, weakening populations before the armies arrived. There was no time for gradual exposure, no opportunity for immune systems to adapt. The Roman contact is slower. Marcus Valerius and his 6 ships are not the vanguard of a military invasion. They are lost merchants who want to go home. They spend 3 weeks on Hispaniola, trading metal tools and glass beads, the same currency of first contact across every timeline, for fresh water, food, and repairs to their storm-damaged ships. They meet the Taino people. They exchange gifts. They try, with limited success, to communicate, and then they leave. The first Roman diseases reach the Taino with this visit. Some people get sick, some die, but the exposure is limited to a single point of contact, a single island, a small number of Roman sailors. It is not an invasion, it is a cold. The second Roman expedition arrives 5 years later, in 1028. It is larger, 20 ships, carrying diplomats, translators, naturalists, and a detachment of soldiers. It also carries a physician named Claudia Medica, who has been specifically tasked with studying the health of the indigenous population. The Romans are not arriving in ignorance of disease. They have dealt with plague, epidemics, and the health consequences of contact between different populations for centuries. The plague of Justinian alone killed perhaps 30 million. They know what disease can do. Claudia's reports, which survive in this timeline's version of the imperial archives, describe a population suffering from respiratory illness and skin lesions, clearly the aftermath of the first visit's disease introduction. She recommends quarantine protocols for all future contact, the same protocols the empire uses when plague ships arrive in port. The recommendation is adopted. Does this prevent catastrophe entirely? Number disease is not a policy problem. It is a biological reality. Pathogens do not respect quarantine lines, especially in an age before germ theory. Over the following century, Old World diseases kill millions of indigenous people across the Caribbean and the Central American mainland. The death toll is horrific. But it is not 90%. The slower pace of contact, decades between initial exposure and sustained settlement rather than years, allows some degree of immunological adaptation. The quarantine protocols, imperfect as they are, slow the spread. And the Roman approach to settlement, which is fundamentally different from the Spanish approach, changes the dynamics. The Romans do not send conquistadors. They send colonists, families, farmers, engineers, administrators. They build roads. They build aqueducts. They build concrete towns with running water and sewage systems. They extend citizenship to indigenous leaders who cooperate. They do not destroy the existing social structures. They layer Roman administration on top of them, the same way they did in Gaul, in Britain, in Syria, in every province they ever absorbed. It is colonization. Let us not pretend otherwise. It is the imposition of one civilization's structures onto another, backed by overwhelming technological superiority. The indigenous peoples of this timeline's Americas do not choose Roman rule. It is offered to them in terms they cannot refuse. But it is not genocide. The Taino are not exterminated. The mainland civilizations, the Maya, the peoples of the Mississippi Basin, the nascent states of the Andes, are incorporated, altered, diminished, but not destroyed. Their languages persist as regional dialects. Their religious traditions survive beneath a veneer of Roman Christianity. Their agricultural knowledge, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, the crops that will transform the empire's food supply, is documented, valued, and systematically adopted. By 1100, there are Roman cities on 4 continents. The empire's population, swelled by immigration, annexation, and the agricultural revolution that American crops enable, exceeds 200 million. The American crops deserve their own moment because their impact is difficult to overstate. The potato alone, a tuber that grows in poor soil, in cold climates, with minimal labor, transforms agriculture across the empire's northern provinces. A single acre of potatoes produces roughly 4 times the calories of a single acre of wheat. In Britannia, in Gaul, in the Rhine provinces, the potato turns marginal farmland into productive ground. Populations grow. Cities expand. The chronic food insecurity that had plagued the empire's northern territories for 1,000 years begins, slowly, to ease. Corn, maize, does the same in the warmer provinces. Tomatoes transform the cuisine of Italia so completely that within 2 generations, no one can remember what Roman food tasted like before them. Rubber, tapped from Central American trees, provides a flexible, waterproof material that solves engineering problems from gasket seals to insulated wire casing. And tobacco. Tobacco becomes the empire's most profitable commodity crop, grown on plantations in the Caribbean and shipped east in quantities that enrich the treasury and damage the lungs of millions. The New World gives as much as it takes. That is not comfort, but it is true. And on the wharves of the new port city of Nova Roma, built on the natural harbor that in our timeline would be called Havana, Roman engineers are installing something that will shrink the world yet again: copper wire, insulated with rubber tapped from trees in the Central American interior, carrying something invisible, instantaneous, and more powerful than any army. An electrical signal. Chapter 10: The Electric Empire. The Romans knew about electricity, not in the way we know it, not as a theory, not as a system, not as a force to be harnessed, but they knew it existed. They knew that rubbing amber against cloth produced a spark. They knew that certain eels could deliver a painful shock. And they had encountered, in the ruins of a Parthian settlement near Baghdad, a curious clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod that, when filled with vinegar, produced a small but measurable electric current. We call it the Baghdad Battery. It dates to roughly 250 BC. In our timeline, it is a curiosity, a single artifact, an orphaned invention with no descendants and no clear purpose. Some scholars think it was used for electroplating. Others think it was a religious object. We do not know, because the tradition that produced it was broken by the same cascade of collapse that destroyed everything else. In this timeline, the tradition is not broken. The Baghdad Battery is not an orphan here. It is a starting point. Roman engineers encounter it during the Sassanid Wars of the 6th century, and it enters the Engineering Academy curriculum as a demonstration of a known but unexplained natural phenomenon. For 3 centuries, it remains exactly that: a curiosity, a party trick. You can use it to make a frog's leg twitch. You can use it to deposit a thin layer of gold onto a copper bracelet. But nobody knows what it is, why it works, or what it might be useful for. The breakthrough comes from optics, of all places. The Arab-Roman telescope tradition, which we traced in an earlier chapter, has been developing for 2 centuries by the year 1000. Roman lens grinders produce glass of extraordinary clarity. Arab mathematicians have developed a comprehensive theory of light, reflection, refraction, the behavior of lenses and mirrors, that is centuries ahead of anything in our timeline. And the combination of clear glass and good theory produces, by the mid-11th century, the microscope. The first microscopes are crude, handheld lenses that magnify perhaps 20 times. But they improve rapidly, and by 1080, a Roman-trained optician in Alexandria produces a compound microscope that can magnify 300 times. This is the same magnification that Anton van Leeuwenhoek achieved in our timeline around 1680, 600 years later. Under this microscope, a natural philosopher named Theodorus sees something in a drop of amber-rubbed metal filings that changes his understanding of the world. He sees motion, not the random jiggling of dust, but organized, directional motion, particles streaming from one end of a charged metal strip to the other. He does not understand what he is seeing. He calls it the amber current, after the Greek word for amber, electron. It takes 50 years for anyone to connect the amber current to the Baghdad battery. But when the connection is made, around 1130, the practical implications unfold with the speed of a cascade. This is the pattern we have seen again and again in this timeline. A phenomenon is observed. It sits dormant for decades or centuries, filed away as a curiosity. Then someone connects it to a practical need, and the world shifts on its axis. Heroes Aeolipal sat idle for 5 centuries before someone needed a backup power source for a watermill. The Baghdad battery sat idle for 6 centuries before someone looked at it through a microscope and saw the amber current flowing. The gap between discovery and application is not laziness or stupidity. It is the gap between knowing that a thing exists and knowing what it is for. And closing that gap requires, almost always, a collision between 2 previously unrelated fields of knowledge. A Baghdad battery is a chemical cell. It produces electricity through a chemical reaction. It is weak, unstable, and limited. But the principle, convert chemical energy into electrical energy, is scalable. Roman engineers, who have been scaling things up for 17 centuries, know exactly what to do. By 1150, the first industrial-scale batteries are being produced in the copper-smelting districts of Hispania. They are enormous, vats of acid and copper, plates the size of dining tables, wired together in series to produce voltages that can do useful work. The first application is electroplating, which the Romans have been doing on a small scale for centuries. But industrial batteries allow industrial electroplating, the mass production of corrosion-resistant metal coatings that transform shipbuilding, construction, and tool manufacturing. The second application is more consequential. In 1167, a woman named Fabia Electrica, and that surname, like Mechanicus before it, tells you something about how deeply technology has shaped Roman identity, strings a copper wire between 2 battery terminals 500 feet apart. She attaches a magnetic needle at the far end. When she connects the battery, the needle moves. It is the telegraph, not conceptually, not theoretically, not as an idea sketched in a notebook. It is a working device that can transmit information faster than any horse, any ship, any signal fire, at the speed of lightning. Within a decade, telegraph lines run between Rome and Ostia, a distance of 15 miles. Within 3 decades, they connect every provincial capital in Italy. By 1200, there are 30,000 miles of telegraph wire in the empire, strung along the same road network that the Romans built 1,000 years earlier. The roads that were designed to carry legions now carry information. What would you have thought, hearing the clicking of a telegraph for the first time? A sound that means a message sent from Alexandria has arrived in Londinium in the time it takes to draw a breath. A sound that makes the empire, for the first time in its history, truly unified, not in theory, not on paper, but in real time. A governor in Syria can report a crisis and receive instructions from Rome on the same day. A merchant in Gaul can confirm a shipment in Egypt before sunset. A general on the frontier can coordinate with headquarters as events unfold. The telegraph does not just speed up communication, it changes the nature of power itself. An empire that can communicate instantaneously can govern in ways that an empire relying on messengers cannot. Decisions are faster, coordination is tighter, and the center, Rome itself, becomes more powerful relative to the periphery than it has been since Augustus. But the telegraph is only the beginning. The connection between electricity and magnetism, once established, opens a cascade of discoveries that mirrors our own timeline with eerie precision, compressed, as everything in this world is compressed into a fraction of the time. By 1220, Roman engineers have built the first electric motors, spinning coils of copper wire between permanent magnets, converting electrical energy into mechanical motion. By 1250, they have built the first generators, the reverse process, converting mechanical motion into electrical energy. And here is where the steam engine, which has been the backbone of Roman industry for 6 centuries, finds its ultimate purpose. A steam engine turning a generator produces electricity. Electricity can be transmitted through wires for miles. At the other end of the wire, an electric motor converts the electricity back into mechanical work. The factory no longer needs to be next to the coal mine, or the river, or the fuel source. It can be anywhere there is a wire. By 1280, Roman cities are electrified. Street lighting, not gas lamps, but electric arc lights, brilliant and harsh, illuminates the streets of Rome, Alexandria, Lindinium, and Carthage. Factories run on electric motors. The telegraph has evolved into something more sophisticated, a system of encoded electrical signals that can carry not just simple messages, but complex data, transmitted continuously through a network of relay stations that spans 3 continents. The empire in 1300 is connected in ways that our world would not achieve until the late 19th century. And the people who live in it are beginning to turn their eyes upward, past the chimneys, past the smoke, past the wire-laced sky, toward the stars that Al-Hassan first magnified through a Roman lens 500 years ago. The night skyline of Rome in 1300 looks like nothing any ancient Roman could have imagined. The Colosseum, which in our timeline became a quarry, is here a floodlit monument, bathed in electric arc light, its travertine walls glowing white against the dark sky. Around it, the city has grown upward. Steel-framed buildings, 20 and 30 stories tall, crowd the ancient center. The dome of the Pantheon, still the largest unreinforced concrete span on Earth, sits like a pearl among towers. And above the rooftops, a web of copper telegraph wires catches the light, thin lines connecting this ancient city to every corner of an empire that now stretches further than Augustus ever dreamed. Somewhere in that city, a young engineer is sketching plans for a device that will carry a human voice along a wire. She does not know yet whether it will work. She does not know that within 50 years, her invention will make the telegraph look as primitive as the signal fires it replaced. She only knows that sound is vibration, vibration is motion, and motion can be converted to electricity and back again. She is right, and the world is about to get smaller once more. What they see in the stars, and what they dream of doing about it, belongs to the next chapter. Chapter 11, The Modern Ancient World. By the 14th century, the Roman Empire is a civilization that has no parallel in our history. It spans 4 continents. Its population exceeds 300 million. Its cities glow at night with electric light. Its railways move people and goods at 60 miles per hour. Its telegraph network carries messages across oceans in seconds. Its factories produce steel, glass, textiles, and machinery in quantities that our own world did not match until the early 20th century. And its astronomers are making plans to leave the Earth. I need to slow down here, because this is the part of the story where the timeline stretches so far from our reality that it begins to feel like fantasy. It is not, or at least I do not believe it is. The logic that brought us here, the unbroken engineering tradition, the compounding innovations, the feedback loops between theory and practice, is the same logic that shaped our own industrial revolution, our own electrification, our own space age. The difference is not in kind, it is in time. Everything that happened in our world between 1700 and 1969 is happening in this world between 700 and 1400. The gap is approximately 1,000 years, the same 1,000 years that the Dark Ages consumed. Think about that, 1,000 years, 50 generations of human beings. Every person born, lived, and died in a world that was technologically stagnant, not because humans lacked intelligence or ambition, but because the institutional and material foundations for progress had been destroyed. The knowledge was gone. The infrastructure was gone. The engineering academies, the trade networks, the industrial base, all of it, reduced to rubble by a cascade that started at the Danube in 376. In this timeline, those 50 generations were not wasted. They built. By 1350, Roman chemistry, which evolved from the ancient tradition of metallurgy and dyeing, passed through the Arab alchemical tradition and was transformed by the microscope and systematic experimentation, has produced synthetic materials. Rubber, vulcanized and shaped for industrial use from the American provinces. Processed petroleum, refined from deposits in the eastern provinces and used first as lamp oil, then as fuel for a new generation of engines that are lighter and more powerful than steam. And something that we would recognize as plastic, a cellulose-based polymer derived from cotton and wood pulp, moldable, durable, and cheap. Roman medicine, aided by the microscope, has identified the microbial causes of infectious disease. The germ theory of disease, which in our timeline was not established until the work of Pasteur and Koch in the 1860s, is a settled fact in this timeline by 1300. Vaccination, using attenuated strains of disease to build immunity, is practiced empire-wide. The Great Plagues that periodically devastated the ancient world, while not eliminated, are controlled. Life expectancy in Roman cities exceeds 50 years, a number that our own world did not reach until the early 20th century. And in the universities, which evolved from the engineering academies and the great libraries, and which now exist in every major city, scholars are developing theories that we would recognize. A mathematical framework for describing motion, force, and energy that corresponds to Newtonian mechanics, an electromagnetic theory that corresponds to Maxwell's equations, a periodic table of elements, an atomic theory of matter. These are not exact replicas of our science. The intellectual tradition is different, the language is different, the cultural context is different, but the underlying reality is the same. Physics is physics. Chemistry is chemistry. The universe does not change because the people studying it speak Latin instead of English. The question of flight is solved in stages, the same way it was in our timeline. First lighter-than-air craft, hot air balloons, then hydrogen balloons, lifting above the smoke haze cities to photograph the world from an altitude no human has ever experienced. Then heavier-than-air craft, powered by lightweight petroleum engines, guided by the same aerodynamic principles that birds have used for 150 million years. The first sustained powered flight in this timeline occurs around 1370, roughly equivalent to our 1903. By 1400, Roman aircraft fly regular routes between the major cities. By 1430, they cross the Atlantic. By 1450, the question is no longer how to fly, but how high. I am going to tell you what happens next, but first I want to stop and acknowledge something. This world we have built, this gleaming, electric, industrial, four-continent empire, is magnificent, and it is also terrible. What was lost? What was the cost of a world where Rome never fell? Start with the languages. In our timeline, the fall of Rome produced a linguistic explosion. Latin fragmented into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and dozens of regional dialects. Germanic languages flourished where Latin retreated. Celtic languages survived in the margins. Arabic spread across a vast swath of the world. Chinese, Japanese, Sanskrit, Swahili, thousands of languages evolved independently, each one a unique window onto human experience. In this timeline, Latin dominates. It has evolved. 1,000 years of continuous use has changed it dramatically, the way English has changed since Chaucer, but it is still recognizably Latin. It is the language of government, commerce, science, and literature across 4 continents. Other languages survive, but as regional dialects, subordinate to the imperial tongue. How many ways of thinking? How many untranslatable concepts? How many unique perspectives on the human condition were never developed because the culture that might have produced them was absorbed into the Roman whole? We do not know. That is the cruelest part. We cannot miss what was never created. There is no word in this timeline's evolved Latin for the Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, the beauty of impermanence and imperfection, because the culture that produced it developed in isolation from the Roman world. There is no equivalent of the Icelandic sagas, because the Viking Age never happened the way it did in our history. The particular loneliness of those Norse stories, men and women on the edge of the world, facing darkness with nothing but courage and stubbornness. That voice was never born. Consider the art. The European Renaissance, our Renaissance, the one born from the collision of rediscovered classical knowledge with medieval Christian mysticism and Islamic influence, never happens. The particular combination of loss and recovery, of darkness and light, that produced Michelangelo, Leonardo, Dante, Shakespeare, that specific cultural moment does not exist in this timeline. Roman art continues to evolve, certainly. It is sophisticated, skilled, technically brilliant. But the particular fire that burns in art created by people who have known devastation and are rebuilding from ruins, that fire is absent. What about democracy? In our timeline, the long darkness after Rome produced, eventually, new forms of government. The Magna Carta, the English Parliament, the French Revolution, the American Constitution. All of these emerged in part because the centralized power of Rome had been shattered and people were forced to invent new ways of governing themselves. In this timeline, the Senate still exists. Elections are held. Roman law provides rights and protections, but the empire is fundamentally authoritarian. The emperor rules, the bureaucracy administers, the army enforces. There is no Magna Carta because there is no feudal baronage to challenge the crown. There is no French Revolution because there is no France. The political experiments that our world produced through centuries of messy, violent, often failed attempts at self-governance. Those experiments never happen. Is this world better than ours? I do not think the question can be answered. It is richer. It is more advanced. It has less disease, less poverty, longer lives, more knowledge. But it is also more uniform, more controlled, more centralized. The wild, chaotic diversity that the fall of Rome accidentally unleashed, the diversity that eventually produced the modern world, with all its contradictions and all its freedoms, that diversity was never born. I genuinely want to know what you think about this. Would you choose this world over ours? A world without the Dark Ages, but also without the things that the Dark Ages eventually made possible? Tell me in the comments. I do not have a clear answer myself. By 1500 in this timeline, which corresponds roughly to our own present day in terms of technological capability, Roman engineers are building rockets. Not to make war, though the military applications are obvious, but to answer a question that the telescopes first posed 700 years ago, when Alhazen saw 4 lights orbiting Jupiter from a rooftop in Yemen. What is up there? The first Roman satellite enters orbit in 1487. It is a small steel sphere, roughly the size of a melon, carrying a radio transmitter. Because yes, they have radio by now, the logical extension of the telegraph and the electromagnetic theory that underlies it. The transmitter sends a signal back to Earth, a simple beep, repeated every 2 seconds. In our timeline, Sputnik did exactly the same thing in 1957. The sound it made was almost identical. Some sounds, it seems, are universal. The satellite orbits the Earth every 90 minutes. Below it, the planet turns a world that has never known a dark age, that has never forgotten how to make concrete or cut glass or calculate the stress on a bridge. A world where the roads still run straight from province to province, where Latin is still spoken from Londinium to Nova Roma to the trading posts on the coast of China. A world that glows at night, not with campfires, but with electric light. A web of illumination visible, presumably, from orbit, tracing the outlines of an empire that has endured for 2,000 years. It is magnificent, and it is not ours. And there is something in that gap between what was built and what was lost, between the world that endured and the world that broke and rebuilt itself in 1,000 different shapes. That brings us, at last, back to the river where we began. Chapter 12, The River and the Dream. We began at the Danube. We should end there. The river is still flowing. It has been flowing since long before Rome existed, and it will flow long after every empire is forgotten. 1,770 miles from the Black Forest to the Black Sea, through gorges and floodplains, past cities that in one timeline crumbled and in another grew tall enough to scrape the clouds. In this timeline, the one we have spent the last few hours building together, the Danube is no longer a frontier. It has not been a frontier for 1,000 years. The watchtowers that once guarded its banks have been converted into restaurants, museums, lookout points for tourists who ride the rail lines that run along both shores. The signal fires are gone. The sentries are gone. The fear is gone. In their place, there are bridges. Hundreds of them. Stone bridges and steel bridges, and one, near the old garrison town of Aquincum, that is made entirely of glass, an architectural marvel, translucent in the morning sun, built by engineers who are the direct professional descendants of the men who poured the concrete walls of the Pantheon. A woman stands on that glass bridge in the early morning. She is looking down at the water. She is a historian. They still have historians in this world because human beings never stop wanting to understand where they came from. She studies the 4th century, the age of Valens, the age of the Great Decision. She knows about the Goths. She knows about Fritigern and Alavivus and their desperate plea to cross. She knows that Valens said no. It is one of the most studied moments in the imperial archive, the decision that, by the narrowest of margins, preserved the empire that built the world she lives in. But she also knows, because the historians in this timeline are honest, and because the printing press made it impossible to suppress inconvenient truths, that 200,000 people were left to die on the far side of this river, that the decision which saved an empire condemned a nation, that the Goths, turned away from the only refuge they could see, were scattered, enslaved, and ultimately absorbed into the Hun Confederacy. Their language died, their culture died. Their names were forgotten, except in the Roman records that documented their refusal. She thinks about this sometimes, standing on the bridge. The glass is cool under her hands. The river moves below, the same river, carrying the same water to the same sea. And she wonders, as historians always wonder, whether it was worth it. Whether the gleaming world behind her, with its electric lights and its railway stations and its rocket gantries pointed at the sky, is sufficient justification for the world that was erased to build it. She does not have an answer, neither do I. But I think the question itself is worth carrying. The way a river carries stones, not to any particular destination, but because that is what rivers do. They carry things, they smooth the edges, they deposit them somewhere downstream in a place no one planned. This is where the story ends, and this is where I need to tell you something about the story you have been listening to. It is not real. None of it happened. Valens said yes. The Goths crossed. Adrianople fell. Rome fell. The Dark Ages came, and they lasted 1,000 years, and when they ended, the world that emerged was our world, messy, fractured, beautiful, and free in ways that the eternal empire we imagine tonight could never quite be. The roads still lead to Rome. The concrete still holds. The calendar still bears the names of emperors, but the empire itself is gone, and in its absence, 1,000 flowers bloomed that could never have grown in its shadow. French and Spanish and Italian grew from the fragments of Latin. Gothic cathedrals rose from the rubble of Roman temples. And the 1,000 small kingdoms that replaced the one great empire eventually produced, through struggle, through failure, through revolution, the idea that ordinary people could govern themselves. I told you this story not because I think the world would be better if Rome had survived. I told it because I think there is something valuable in following a thread as far as it will go, in taking one moment, one decision, one summer afternoon on the banks of a river, and asking what if. And because there is something restful about alternate histories, they remind us that the world is not inevitable, that things could have gone differently, that the particular arrangement of light and shadow that makes up your life, this job, this city, this night, this exact moment of quiet, is one version of a story that has been told 1,000 different ways. And all of them are true in the way that dreams are true, not because they happened, but because they could have. You do this every night, in a way. Every time you close your eyes and drift toward sleep, your mind loosens its grip on what is real and begins to explore what might be. The borders between the world as it is and the world as it could have been grow soft. The river between waking and sleeping is not so different from the Danube, a boundary that seems absolute when you are standing on one side and dissolves completely when you finally let yourself cross. For the next entry in the archive, I have been exploring something I have never covered before, a library that was deliberately hidden beneath a desert, sealed in jars by people who knew they were about to die and wanted their words to survive them. But that is for another night. Some of you crossed the river a long time ago. You are already there on the far side where the water sounds different and the light is softer.